The Russians wanted Berlin all for themselves, so they decided to close all highways, railroads, and canals from Germany and Berlin. The Russians were hoping that the action would make it impossible for the people to get food and other essential supplies. This information is relevant because it changed the way we live today. A lot of people died, and we may have lost somewhat of a culture when some of the people from Berlin died. The Russians are trying to threaten the U.S. by this event so that when the Soviet Union gave orders to the U.S., they would follow. If this event didn't happen, the U.S. might not have made the decisions they did about the Russians.
The people that were involved was President Truman, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill. They wanted to divide Germany into what they saw was 4 temporary zones: the American, the French, British, and Soviet. The Soviet zone was divided into 4. The reason why it was relevant because Truman and Stalin and Churchill wanted everybody separated into their own territories. It showed that the correlation of what happened and who all were involved in the Berlin Airlift. Soviets placed a blockade on the Allied part of Berlin in order to starve the city. Since this happened, the Berlin Airlift was brought into play and was flown day and night to feed the city. This is relevant because if the blockade was never placed to starve Berlin, the aircraft would have never been used. Therefore, if it wasn't for the blockade, this event would have never happened. The Berlin Airlift affected society during 1948 because it saved the population of Berlin from starving to death. It is relevant because without the airlift, the whole population would have starved to death and there would be no end to the record.
It affected the people who lived in Berlin because some of them were killed. Once it was over, the people of Berlin had to move on and keep going with their life. For example, what the U.S. did on 9/11. It also affected the Russians because their plan to take over Berlin didn't work, so they can't continue on what they were expecting to do once they took over Berlin. This information is relevant because if the Russians' plan had worked, then a lot of things in history after that might have changed. The people of Germany would have starved, and then part of Germany would not exist. Berlin in Germany is used today for trade, and if the population there was wiped out, then we wouldn't have certain items. And if the plan after the Soviets would have overrun Germany, it would now be a controlled city. It affects the world today because the Berlin Airlift saved millions of people from starving. Therefore, Berlin still exists today and its population is not wiped out. Also, trade routes with Berlin and Germany still exist. This is important because we wouldn't have Berlin today. We use Germany for trade of cars and other machinery, so without them we wouldn't have certain items.